Well, it falls to me to say good evening to everybody and a very, very warm welcome to this event, which is a book launch for Lina's new book. My name, as you'll see on the screen, is Ian Birch, and if you don't know me, I'm the principal of the Scottish Baptist College, and I'm a colleague of Lina's and very proud to be so. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to this book launch, which I think in a wonderful way unites friends and colleagues and students and people who know Lina from across the world, and that's delightful. And it also draws us together with an interest in the theme that she has written about, which is singleness and marriage and family and church community. So a brief word of introduction. Lina is the assistant principal and lecturer in practical theology at the Scottish Baptist College. She is an accomplished musician and an artist, as well as a theologian of international standing. She's particularly interested in ethics and spirituality, the theology of culture, and all of this is evident in her work. And she also describes herself as having a second love of history, that is, people and stories which have shaped the world in which we live today. And if you've read her book, you'll see the way in which historical people and historical stories illuminate the ideas that she wants to share with us. So we gather tonight to celebrate the publication of her latest book, Singleness and Marriage After Christendom. And we're going to unpack some of the main themes and the insights of that book by listening to various guest speakers throughout the evening. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome all of them from Canada and from south of England, as well as Scotland. I'll introduce them as we go along. So if you've had a chance to read Lina's book, you'll know what a great achievement Lina has pulled off in this latest work. And that is that it is a book that is an absolute joy to read. It's very accessible, conversational in tone in many places, and yet is also rich in scholarship of the highest order. It's a book, I think, that every church and every Christian community ought to be studying and reflecting on as we wrestle with the complexity of family in today's society. And so we're really looking forward to getting to know what's in this book a little bit more. Lina is going to begin by sharing some of the main ideas, and then there are a number of respondents who I will introduce. And after they have each spoken for a short while, there will be a chance to ask questions or to make comments. And the easiest way of doing that will be through the chat facility in Zoom. So you can post a comment or a question into the chat and somebody will pick that up. And if you don't know how to do that, then there is a hand waving device in Zoom as well. You could click on that and we will pick up your interest to ask a question. And if that defeats you as well, then it would also be acceptable to literally wave a physical hand, and we will spot that on the screen. Because we're really keen that everybody has a chance who wants to participate in the evening as we explore this really important subject that is before us. So, Lina, I'm going to hand over to you at this point and give you the chance to speak. And then Stewart Murray Williams will be the first of our respondents.
Thank you, Ian. Well, how does one speak briefly about something that took quite a long time to write? And yet that's exactly what I found myself doing, especially since the publication of the book. And that's what I'll attempt in the next few minutes as well. In the pages of this book, I'm exploring a big and complex change that is taking place in our world and is particularly noticeable in Western societies. The decline of marriage rates, the ease of divorce, and the rise of cohabitation have all contributed to the sense that the familiar form of marriage and family is dwindling. At the same time, single people have become the fastest growing demographic group, often making up more than half of the adult population. In the eyes of some, these changes represent a threat to the survival of Christianity itself. Well, This book takes a very different perspective, starting with biblical grounds. It is true that marriage and having children were fundamental, absolutely fundamental for the people of Israel. Although, of course, the shape and purpose of marriage was rather different from what the proponents of traditional family values tend to have in mind today. But the teaching of Jesus would have seemed truly baffling to his contemporaries, both when he insisted that husbands must stay married and faithful to their wives, and even more radically, when he celebrated those who chose to forego marriage for the sake of the kingdom of God. His vision, seeped in the prophetic tradition, was of a new kind of a family. Those who were drawn to this teaching had to be willing to trust that following Jesus was worth the price of reordering their earthly relationships. And so for some of his early followers, their Christian allegiance meant losing their previous identity and economic security, and joining instead an alternative support system, a new order family called the church, which quickly became regarded as an affront to existing family patterns. One of the starkest examples of the Christian clash with the prevailing norms was the Christian embrace of asceticism and celibacy, which also went against the imperial policy requiring all Roman citizens to be married. Of course, many early Christians did marry, but the practice of celibacy was an embodiment of a conviction that the kingdom of God was already present, already here. And as for married Christians, having children was no longer the key element of what it meant to live in God's will, or how faith was to be passed on, or how death was to be overcome. Then came the long era of Christianization. Christendom's culture picked up the early Christian enthusiasm for celibacy and established it as a superior state to marriage. Or at least this was the official line. What went on in practice was a different matter, as illustrated by the length of time it took to enforce priestly celibacy in the Western Church. But Christendom also encompassed lesser known forms of singlehood and alternative family arrangements, religious revival movements, confraternities, and guilds. To me, these were some of the most fascinating stories I got to explore during the course of writing this book. During the period of Reformation, the abuses of enforced celibacy became one of the focal points in the preaching of the Protestant reformers. Before too long, the newly Protestant lands were marked by a culture of suspicion towards those who were single without a good reason. Yet in contrast to the medieval Roman Catholic position, which saw marriage's primary purpose in procreation and having children, the magisterial Reformation brought to the fore the idea of marriage as a special companionship. As time went on, and particularly in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, romance and emotional bonds became the primary goods of marriage. As countless romantic novels would tell us, one fell in love and then created a family home as a shelter from the troubles of the world. As this new Victorian ideal took root, it also came to represent the peak of human happiness that could be achieved here on Earth. And this is the worldview we have inherited, and under the power of which we still largely live. It's particularly true in relation to romance. Unless you have loved, the message runs, you have hardly lived. And even an unhappy love story is still better than none. The contemporary wedding industry is an illustration of romance's continuing enthrallment and an indication of how much power it still yields or wields, even in the face of widespread cohabitation and divorce. The persistence of this storyline has been truly remarkable. Even though the contemporary happiness industry keeps affirming and encouraging an exploration of different pathways to happiness, and even as singles and single households continue to grow in numbers, the sense of marriage and coupledom as a norm still prevails, for now at least. What is also interesting is how this storyline gets expressed in the church context, in terms of the Christian happiness package, so to speak. While it is acknowledged that God's will may lead us to a path which does not involve marriage, romantic love and happy coupledom still function as the ultimate symbol and expression of God's blessing. So as we watch Christendom melt away, I ask, how can our single lives and our marriages and our perceptions of a good life become more aligned with the teaching of Jesus and his insistence on the faithfulness for a life required in marriage, but even more stunningly, his call for abstaining from coupledom as a celebration of God's kingdom? How should this really hard to swallow teaching shape our understanding of singleness and marriage today? So I look at a number of key areas of life, personal and communal, which may help us live into some answers. I discuss different ways, explicit and implicit, in which churches can convey their views on singleness and marriage. I look at the importance of such practices as friendship, which can be more than just a personal relationship, but also a community building and missional practice to which we are invited as the friends of Jesus, and therefore friends of sinners. But here's the thing. Practices like these need the local church to be a genuine community of belonging, a safe and transformative environment for making sense of our unresolved questions, our bodily yearnings, and the difficult, at times painful twists and turns of our lives. In such an environment, we can all learn a much deeper and broader sense of fertility and creativity. The demographic shift we are witnessing may well give the church a really precious gift, compelling Christian communities to re-examine the role of blood and marriage ties within the context of the larger family of God. These communities will need to do some serious work in reimagining and relearning happiness. As we engage in this work of reimagining and relearning happiness, we are invited to make meaning out of the different and challenging circumstances we may find ourselves in. My hope is that some of the ideas I have shared in this book may be of help and of inspiration to those who yearn for such creative meaning makings in their own lives, both as either single or coupled individuals and as communities of God's people. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. And you've kept scrupulously to time, which is great. That was really, really helpful as an introduction to the main themes and an overview of the book. Now, Dr. Stewart Murray Williams is the series editor of the series that Lina has contributed to, the After Christendom series. He's also the director of the Centre for Anabaptist Studies at Bristol Baptist College. And we are absolutely delighted that Stewart can join us this evening. And he's going to make the opening response to what Lina has written and said. Thanks, Stewart.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Lina. Yes, as Ian mentioned, I'm the series editor of the After Christendom series, and Lina is the author of the 16th book in the series. So we have been going for quite some time. And so before engaging a little bit with some of the contents of Lina's book, I'd just like to say a little bit about the series, because that provides the broader context for this particular book. So the series began in 2004 with my own book, Post Christendom, which really laid the foundation for the series and invited other authors to begin to pick up some of the themes that were briefly mentioned there rather than fully developed. But the assumption behind the series, and the thing that we've been exploring over the last 16 years or so now, is that the end of Christendom, the demise of the Christianization process that Lina's just spoken about, is a hugely significant shift in Western culture that has massive consequences for society and for church. And that this is an opportunity to re-examine many of the things that we are familiar with and to ask quite searching questions. I guess for many people, the demise of Christendom and the marginalization of the church in Western culture seems to be quite threatening. Many people are discouraged by that, and there are certainly many challenges associated with it. But I would also want to suggest that it's a time of great opportunity. It's a time when the foundations are being shaken, and actually we have an opportunity to ask some really quite important questions about where we've been and where we're going. So Post-Christendom simply opened up the topic, really, and different authors over the years have responded in different ways and have engaged with particular aspects of that, asking what difference the end of Christendom has made in a variety of areas of faith and life. The basic framework for many of the books, and you will have seen it if you've read Lina's book, is to look at three periods in Western church history: pre-Christendom, Christendom, and post-Christendom. That is recognizably somewhat simplistic, but it's actually very helpful because they are three significant aspects of church history. There was a
Stewart, you're not very interesting, are you? You're quite boring, actually.
There are quite a number of indications that what happened in the 4th century was really quite dramatic and changed things very significantly for the early church. And then for hundreds of years, the Christendom system grew and developed, and many things changed as a result of that. And what we're seeing now is another seismic shift. So while I don't defend the tripartite approach as highly adequate, nevertheless, I think it's a useful way of looking at the past and considering some of the aspects that we need to consider today. So far, 20 authors have responded to this challenge. Some have books still to be published. 5 of the books have been co-authored, and most of them, if not all of them, have benefited from conversations. So they've come out of a community rather than just being written by individuals.
I think we have an imposter, a mugman.
We clearly have an intruder at present. I will carry on and hope that our technical host can deal with this in some way.
I think it was red. I saw him in electrical.
I will try to continue. What is that community? Well, it has particularly been the Anabaptist community. Most of those who have written have engaged to a greater or lesser extent with the Anabaptist tradition, which emerged in the 16th century and was perhaps one of the first movements to thoroughly challenge the Christendom environment, to suggest that actually what had happened in the Christendom era was problematic and needed to be re-examined. But the series also engages with a range of other traditions, and it's been interesting how widely it's been read, and I think perhaps by 2 different groups of people. By those who have been particularly interested in a specific subject, in this case, singleness and marriage, and by others who have been interested in the whole after Christendom framework and have picked up book after book to see how that framework relates to different particular topics. So essentially the series is challenging assumptions, it's asking questions, it's wondering how much has been distorted over the years and how much we can use this transition as an opportunity for renewal and theological reflection. And Lina's book is an excellent example of this. You'll have seen that the framework, it does pick up this pre-Christendom, Christendom and post-Christendom arrangement. It challenges many of the assumptions that have been made. Things that we perhaps thought were biblical, but perhaps more cultural. Things that we thought were traditional, but actually are more recently we realized. And I value that. And let me just say a little bit about what I have particularly valued from Lina's book, having set it in the context of the series. I was particularly grateful for fresh insights on subjects such as singleness, romance, family, happiness, fulfillment, and a range of other subjects, things that Lina has already mentioned. I'm particularly grateful for the interweaving of biblical and historical perspectives with contemporary concerns. It just seems to hang together. And perhaps above all, I was particularly struck by Lina's persistent emphasis on the church as the new family that takes priority over blood relationships. That seemed to me to be the most radical and potentially most exciting part of what she's written. A really challenging emphasis in a culture that downplays commitment to the church and invests unrealistically in the nuclear family. That seems to be an important transition that we need to be grappling with. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I preached on Mark 10, which is the story of Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler and the bemusement of the disciples as they ask, well, what about us? We've left everything to follow you. What's in it for us? And Jesus says, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me in the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children and fields, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. So not just rewards in heaven, but actually something significant in this age, a huge family. I've travelled all over the world in the last 25, 30 years and have stayed in hundreds of different Christian homes, some quite grand, many very simple. And I'm just so grateful for the hospitality received in this global Christian family. There is something about that global family that is quite remarkable. And for me, it has underscored, perhaps what for me has been the most significant part of what Lina has written, that this is something transformational. This is something which is much broader, much more exciting than perhaps we've seen. Church at its best, and to be fair, it's not always at its best, but church at its best is this alternative and more radical kingdom family that we are privileged to belong to. So I guess my hope is that Lina's book will help to reset our thinking about singleness and marriage, but also that it will help to inspire us to reimagine all that church can be, both locally and globally. So Lina, thank you. Thank you for what you shared.
Thank you, Stewart, and thanks for battling through the unwelcome interruptions. You did really well there. We are delighted as well to have from Canada an old friend of the Scottish Baptist College, old in the sense of we have known Irma for quite a long time, and it's delightful to have her with us tonight. Irma is the Associate Professor of Practical Theology at the Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg. And her teaching and research interests include pastoral care and counselling, gender studies and ministry formation. And you might be interested to know that Irma's students in Winnipeg are using the book, well, as I understand things, are using the book as something of a textbook and a course that she teaches at the current time. And I know that Lina has had the chance to actually participate in the class. So it's great to have those links between the two institutions. And it's lovely to have you this evening. Well, evening for us, Irma. You are very welcome. And we're looking forward to your response to what Lina has written. Thank you.
Thank you for that very helpful clarification on age.
Apologies.
Sorry, I'm 60, well, almost. But old friend, that's good. I am thrilled to join you today. I'm delighted. Actually, Lina and I have been talking about this book for years. And I think one of our first really good conversations was around this subject matter. I have been certainly very self-interested in this book as a professor, as a teacher in practical theology, as a feminist Christian, desperately feeling we needed help in the free church tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, around thinking about these things. I'm going to give a particular response actually today in conversation, actually an extension of conversation with my students. I teach a course at CMU, Canadian Mennonite University, that Ian mentioned, that Lina joined us a few weeks ago. That's called, quote, Marriage and Family in Christian Perspective. It's a title that came from the mid-90s, I think someone, and it, these titles just keep getting moved forward. My students just call the course Sex with Irma. and I've tried to change it, but they still, for years and years, they just nickname it Sex with Irma. For years, I have struggled to find a textbook for this course. I was looking for something. I wanted a book that would name the idolatry that marriage and family has become in the church, the insidious hegemony of it all. I recall growing up in a church where your name was kept on the youth list until you were married. And so you'd have like 45-year-olds' names on the youth list. I don't understand that. In some ways, I've been grateful that we lost a sacramental view of marriage in the divorce settlement of the Protestant Reformation. But on the other hand, I think that what has replaced it has not been very helpful for us, especially for those of us who are in the Free Church or Anabaptist traditions. I was looking for something that would open up our Christian imagination for singleness. And I was looking for a book that engaged the intersectionality of marriage, family, singleness, that named the social construction of marriage, captured the historical narrative, the theological narrative that have shaped the Christian imagination, and to name the cultural contextual nature alongside the theological and biblical. That's what I was looking for. And then Lina wrote this book, and it checked all my boxes. And on top of that, it was a hospitable book, accessible and invitational in the way it invited the readers to engage. So what I did in preparation for today is I invited all of my students in this year's class, there are 25 of them, I said to write a response to the book, and I would include some of what they said in response. So this is more their reflection, although of course I picked the things that I thought were right on, and I left the ones that were off. So let me just say a couple of responses that came from these students. And this is an undergraduate course, and it's a first-year course. So it means that there could be as young as 18-year-olds in the class, and probably the average age is maybe 21 years old in this class of these students here. My first, and I'm using a phrase that a student has written to capture these perspectives. My first perspective, a liberating word. The Christian, ahem, they said, Babylonian captivity of marriage. That's the subtitle. A consistent response I received from students is that they found Lina's perspectives liberating. And this was especially true for women in the course, but not exclusively so. The book helped students to name, as one student called it, the Babylonian captivity of marriage, which I thought was an interesting play, but named the Christian captivity that marriage has become and the ensuing pressure that students have felt in many of their communities. But this liberation was not just limited to the church. One of my male students stated, quote, "It was a powerful cultural message that is the dream of partnership is one that I have rarely ever been forced to question before. How the primacy of marriage has become a force of marginalization," is what the students said. And I thought, yeah, that's true. There was another student who talked about another kind of liberation in this book. And that was a liberation for singleness and a raising awareness. One student said she loved the book for its ability to liberate by naming the weaponization of virginity and celibacy in the church. Now, that was her phrase. Oh, citing her own congregation where she said was using celibacy as a way of punishing gays. Lina's book opened up both its abuse and its possibility. Singleness is blessing and its curse. And again, I'm quoting from students. One other under the theme of "This was a liberating word." For others, the book liberated marriage and singleness from being solely about theology and the church and about scripture. The recognition of how social cultural context has always in the history of the church shaped our understanding and practice of marriage and singleness. Any understanding of marriage and singleness is necessarily dynamic. Marriage is, as one student says, a moving target that changes. And I thought that was a helpful insight. A second category of comments, and maybe I've said this a little bit already, but I just want to highlight, is people recognized and appreciated the contextual nature of singleness and marriage. And here I want to pick up on this in another way. I have diverse students in my class, even though it is a Canadian Mennonite university. We do have our share of Mennonite students, but we have many students who are broadly evangelical, free church Baptist types. I also have lots of students who aren't religious at all, who are at the university taking music therapy or peace and conflict studies and have no religious background, and they're in the course too. And I had lots of Catholics this year. And Catholics with a cross-cultural influence, lots of Filipino Catholics, Albanian Catholics. I had an Ethiopian Orthodox. It made for a fascinating engagement across the spectrum as we all read a common text. If, quote, if, as Toth seems to assert, the church's understanding of marriage and singleness is at least partly rooted in shifting social norms, that needs to be viewed now. We need to look at marriage now with a critical eye. I was caught particularly as someone who's been so rooted in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. I was caught by the lens by which, say, my Indigenous students, First Nations students were reading the book, and I had a couple in the class. And they named it both, two of them named it very sharply. This is really an issue of the colonizers. Those who colonized Indigenous people and brought with these understandings of marriage that have really ripped apart a lot of our Indigenous families. And I thought that was a painful thing to hear. Not so much a critique of the book, but how the book was able to begin to understand how this was functioning. I recognized how my Catholic and Anglican students identified and seemed to think that their traditions didn't have the same issues that we Free Church people had. And enough of them named that, they said they didn't in some ways recognize what Toth was talking about, and I wanted to respect that. And I also wanted to highlight, I had a number of African students, and they really highlighted how much they appreciated the cultural location. Let me say one more point, one more category of points that students raised, and students said this in various ways, but I'm going to use it under the title, "How is this not theology?" At the beginning of Lina's book, she says this is not a theology book, you know, in the sense of a theology of marriage in the classical sense. And it was interesting how many people picked up on this. How is this not a theology of marriage? Indeed, the whole book is a beautiful kaleidoscope that is theology at its very best, at least in my opinion. It's theological anthropology, the view of the human person. It's historical theology. It's biblical theology. And as many students said, this book is as much about the church as it is about marriage and singleness. And I was glad they recognized that. I want to close with one comment that one of my students wrote. I wonder if moving away from the notion of the nuclear family and returning to broader notions of inclusive households, where as anyone who lives under one roof as the smaller units within communities, I wonder if this just isn't the shift that the church so desperately needs right now to find itself. I found that was a helpful and a very hopeful response. That's all I'll leave it with, but thank you for this book, and I've really enjoyed engaging you and engaging the students with this.
Irma, thank you so much. That has been absolutely fascinating, and to have channeled through you the perspectives of the wider community which you work with and live with has enriched our conversation so much. That's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And next we are going to hear from Dr. Andrew Clark, and Andrew is also a good friend of the college here in Paisley. Andrew used to teach New Testament at the University of Aberdeen, and for a number of years he was also a teacher at the Baptist College. And currently he serves churches across the Baptist Union of Scotland, assisting in their leadership development. And so we're absolutely delighted that Andrew can bring his biblical wisdom and experience to bear on this subject, and particularly on what Lina has said. So over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. As one of a number of reviews this evening, mine also is a personal comment to add to those of Stewart and Irma's students as well. And I'll focus on what especially has struck me. And in our postmodern world of reader response, I'll be interested to hear to what extent my observations aligned with the author's intended take-homes for the reader. Lina has revealed, she's highlighted for me some of my own narrow, default, inherited and in many ways inexcusable assumptions about marriage and about singleness. I have gratefully embraced this book as an opportunity both to disturb and to broaden my own casual, generalizing categories of what is normal, typical, desirable. And to that extent, the book hasn't disappointed. And so tonight, my contribution is in part a submission, a vulnerable submission to a rather public confessional. In a book entitled Singleness and Marriage, the most significant, and I'm genuinely hoping the most abiding impact for me, has been on my awareness that marriage and singleness ought not to be regarded as two simple and polarized opposites. There are lots of takeaways in such a wide-ranging book, but for me, the outstanding one is this greater appreciation of both the extent of diversity within each of these categories, the extent of diversity, but also the degree of overlap between these two categories. And as these messages, these twin messages are heard, surely they ought to resolve in the church's energetic undermining of any attempt to treat them as straightforward binaries. That is, you're either married, in which case a narrow and generic set of assumptions about marriage apply to you, or you're single, in which case all the blinkered assumptions about singleness presumably apply to you. So if Paul wanted to take down that dividing wall of hostility, or spoke at least of taking down that dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile, which was paralleled also between slave and free and between male and female, might a new focus for our society become a similar questioning of some of the divisions and stereotypes surrounding the categories of singleness and marriage? And where family fits around, between, and within these two multiform categories. So this book has reinforced for me that a long list of many of life's rich or indeed painful experiences are not exclusively the prerogative either of singleness or of marriage. So parenting, a number of categories here that are not the prerogative of singleness or marriage: parenting, loneliness, happiness, romance, youthfulness, old age, being sexually active, cohabitation, having close family. None of these is exclusively the domain either of marriage or singleness. Rather, there are multiple seemingly endless, complex and overlapping permutations. And yet, as Lina points out, singleness and marriage are each so often viewed in narrow, limiting, unequal, and often prejudicial senses. How many married people are, to all intents and purposes, both single and lonely? Or single and happy? How many married people are single and lonely? Or single and happy? By virtue of their employment, by virtue of old age, by virtue of ill health? Why do so many assume that singleness is the state that self-evidently precedes marriage rather than is a likely state after marriage and bereavement, or an abiding state both in the here and now as well as the hereafter, as Lina has pointed out? And so might I be permitted to misquote the opening line of one of Jane Austen's most well-known works: "It is not a truth universally acknowledged that a single man or woman, whether or not they are in possession of a good fortune, must be in want of a partner." And similarly, why do we so often consider either that family presupposes marriage or that marriage presupposes children? Indeed, why is it that even for those of us who have become a little bit more enlightened, having read through this book, the words marriage and family are more readily associated in a sentence and contrasted, on the other hand, with singleness? And I think there might even have been moments in the book when marriage and family were more readily associated. So gradually, and yet still insufficiently, we have become acclimatized to recognize that there are a number of characteristics that are protected from discrimination by law. For some decades, we have recognized age. For less time, pregnancy, disability, race, religion, gender, including reassignment, and sexual orientation. And in this country, no one is supposed to be placed at an unfair disadvantage or victimized on the basis of any of these categories. Indeed, marriage or being in a civil partnership is a protected characteristic by law, but not singleness. Is part of the problem an inability to recognize or acknowledge diversity of experience, diversity of desire, diversity of journey? Happiness and contentment, frustration and loneliness are neither the prerogative nor necessarily even the norm for either of these categories. So the more that we see singleness and marriage in binary, mutually exclusive terms, the more the problem will persist. Churches have long developed ways of distinguishing between different categories of children and youth. We're very good at that. do they also have the ability to be flexible in framing multiple diverse categories of singles and marrieds that recognize the youthful and the pensioners, the non-married couples, and the single marrieds? And with all these pitfalls, should we expect that during this evening, perhaps all of us might at some point or other be guilty of unintentional yet indefensible stereotyping? Would it not be entirely understandable, even in a book like this, for there to be the occasional relaxation in assumptions? Society has got a very long way to go, and the church may have even further to travel. And this book is being launched at not a moment too soon. A second area which especially piqued my interest is the way in which Lina has ranged in such a small book across the whole of the biblical canon, and then also traversing so much of church history. Some of the questions in regard to the biblical canon that surfaced for me include these.
Andrew, can you just maybe do another minute or so? And
I can, yes.
That'd be great, thanks.
To what extent are the Old Testament values of marriage, family, and childhood more a matter of cultural necessity than of divine imprimatur? In a world without pensions, in a nation at significant risk of military attack, in an agricultural context subject to many climate vulnerabilities, was the purpose of biblical marriages narrowly for the continuation of the family line through sons, or a question of national security, social need, business success, etc.? For a poorer agricultural family, the production of a male might be more pressingly a matter of life and limb than the continuation of the family name. And in the New Testament, we might note that some of the New Testament letters appear to be written to whole communities, including slaves. Female slaves who did have children would neither be categorized as married nor necessarily as a servant, as a parent, as Lina has noted. Again, we find a complexity here and the non-binary nature of the categories of singleness and childbearing. For these slaves, it would not primarily have been these aspects that influenced their dominant sense of shame. It's not shame alone that's related to these categories of singleness, marriage, or childbearing. And one final, very brief observation is on the question of happiness, Lina's final area of discussion in the book. The tension between revising biblical criteria for a new age in society, which Lina addresses, or of relativizing one set of biblical criteria in favor of the primacy of Christological imperatives, may just lead us also to reframe the source and context for happiness. Might it be, I finish here, that happiness, as redefined by Jesus, lies not in marriage, nor singleness, nor parenting, nor family, but in being poor in spirit, pure in heart, meek, mourning, peacemakers who are engaged in the pursuit of righteousness? I thank you, Lina, and I thank Whit Funstock. I'm profoundly grateful.
Andrew, that's such beautiful insights. Thank you so much. There's an awful lot to unpack then, to think about from your response, and helping us to see deeper into the issues. Thank you. That has been tremendous, terrific. Thank you, indeed. Last but by no means at all least, we are delighted to have another Canadian, Melody Maxwell, who is, well, at least teaching in a Canadian context. We're delighted to have you, Melody. Melody serves as the Associate Professor of Christian History at Acadia Divinity College. She has written multiple books and articles about Baptist women's history, and is deeply interested in the experience of women in the church. And she's currently co-editing a volume on Baptists and gender, so has a great deal of experience and expertise to bring to bear on an analysis of Lina's book. So thank you so much for sparing the time to be with us today. We welcome you and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to review Singleness and Marriage After Christendom. I have long been impressed by Lina, her intellect, her faith commitment, and so I'm pleased to call you, Lina, a colleague in the Baptist Academy. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to review this book, which expands on her previous research in a way, as others have mentioned, that's accessible to general readers, and that seeks to answer the question that she poses on page 2, and that is, how did it happen that today's Christianity is so often associated with fixating on marriage and the nuclear family in a way that stands in contrast to the world portrayed in the New Testament? And so in my estimation, Lina presents a really compelling and well-organized argument. She discusses the historical development of the ideas of singleness and marriage within Christianity and society, and proposes ways that Christians can live a fulfilled life in community in today's post-Christian context. And my own life experience exemplifies what Lina calls the turbulent shifts taking place in Western societies and their structures related to the family, if you don't mind allowing me a little self-reflection in my response. I am single, never married, and I live alone in a different country from my parents and extended family. And such a lifestyle, I think, would have been unusual for previous generations of my family. They tended to marry young and live near each other in the Southern United States. And so I recognize that my education and my social context have allowed me to live in a way that my ancestors would not have understood. In fact, sometimes my parents and grandparents, who are steeped in the conservative Christian culture of the late 20th century US, have struggled to understand my marital status and life choices. As Lina notes at the beginning of her volume, some view lifestyles such as singleness to be, and I quote, a direct threat to the future and well-being of society as we know it. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which was home to a conservative megachurch pastor, Adrian Rogers, and his wife, Joyce. They were well-known leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention and the controversy there. They had strong conservative views that influenced Baptists in their own region and beyond. Alongside his teachings in the Bible, Adrian Rogers wrote 10 Secrets for a Successful Family, by which he meant a nuclear family with a father, mother, and multiple happy children. And both Adrian and Joyce emphasized that a woman should marry and submit to their husband. In fact, Joyce wrote that God's chief assignment to woman was to be a truly submissive wife, and upheld that homemaking was the highest task in which a woman could be involved. And so my own grandmother and mother were influenced by the Rogerses and held similar views. And I really vividly remember coming to visit my grandparents during a break from my seminary studies. And sort of true to form, my grandmother and I were in the kitchen preparing a meal for the family. Suddenly, she stopped stirring the green beans and she looked at me intently and she said, Melody, I want you to know that the highest calling in life is to be a homemaker. And at that moment, I felt shamed for my educational pursuits and my lack of marital prospects, like I wasn't able to measure up to what my grandmother considered most important. And my mother's views were and are similar. And she's proud to call herself a homemaker, and she's puzzled that I didn't adopt this vocation, which she sees as essential for a Christian society that she believes is part of the foundation of the United States. And so my own family exemplifies the link that Lina acknowledges between Christianity and family in the Church of late Christendom. And my experience as a single woman typifies the changes that are occurring to this paradigm. Because of my own experiences, I also appreciate Lina's goal in her writing to encourage single people, as she says on page 6, to discover how relevant the radical message of Jesus is to living as a single person and what a gift they are to society and the communities of Jesus. Sometimes I felt that members of my church community were more worried about my status as a single woman than were others outside of the church that I knew. I was treated by fellow church members not like a gift, but as a curiosity and sometimes an object of pity, to be honest. As Lina notes, churches contain fewer single people than do the broader Western society, in part because of the emphasis that churches place on nuclear families. In fact, my parents' church has aligned all of the job titles of their ministers with family stages. Minister of young families, minister of active families, minister of senior families. When I hope their definition of families might include those who are single, but I have to say I feel a bit out of place when I visit their church. Thus, I really resonate with Lina's analysis on page 33 and 85 that Jesus radically reinterpreted human bonds to focus on the kingdom community. And with her encouragement in the book's final chapter, influenced by her Anabaptist views for Christians to find this type of community in their churches. And as a minister, I also appreciate her practical suggestions in this chapter, such as arranging spaces to facilitate the mixing of people and using examples in preaching and teaching that don't assume marriage as the norm. I've probably heard, honestly, hundreds of sermon illustrations about ministers' children and grandchildren, but I'm not sure I've ever heard an illustration drawn from the life of a single person. And as a historian, I also commend Lina's biblical and historical overview of the ideas of singleness and marriage within and beyond Christianity. What a task. Significant to reflect on 2,000 years of Christian history, but she does it well. Her analysis focuses especially on the early years of Christianity, in which community was valued over marital status, and in which celibacy, as we've heard, became prized over marriage. I might have liked to read a bit more on the complex Christian history of family and marriage since the Reformation, but one can only fit so much in a short volume, and Lina has really traced the major currents of thinking and practice well. She highlights the development of asceticism and monasticism, along with the influence of thinkers such as Aquinas and Augustine, and the roles of the Reformation and Victorian ideology in promoting marriage. Her writing deftly explains how Western ideas of mothers as keepers of home and family life that were created in the 19th and 20th centuries continue to influence contemporary thinking. And she also helpfully traces the development of the idea of romantic love and its influence on marriage and family life. Of special interest in Lina's historical narrative, as she mentioned herself, are the roles of celibate women throughout Christian history. These were women who defied conventional expectations, often out of a desire for closer fellowship with God. And she details the lives and influences, really fascinating, multiple historical women. And so here I'll take the opportunity to note the history of another group of single women on which some of my research has focused and which might augment the material in Lina's book. And that's single women in the 19th and early 20th centuries who embarked upon careers of missionary service overseas, filling roles that they believed only single women could. In their view, married women were too busy with their families to complete the needed ministries, and men were barred by custom from working closely with women in some countries. And so these single women challenged the Victorian paradigm of marriage and did so in a way that many Christians found acceptable and even admirable. And so their story joins those of other groups of women that Lina highlights in her book. So I would say overall throughout the book, Lina effectively, unobtrusively weaves insights from experts into her narrative without losing sight of her non-specialist audience, as we've already heard. Of added value, I thought, were the quotations she included at the beginning of each section of the book. Each chapter, in my thinking, is refreshingly well written and edited, and it can be read in a single short sitting, although reflection on its contents will continue long after the book is closed. And so I commend Singleness and Marriage After Christendom, not only to ministry leaders, but also to lay people, students, and anyone interested in relationships and the church, biblically, historically, and theologically, where we've been, where we are, and where we might go in the future. So for such an accomplishment, Lina, I commend you. Thank you.
Melody, we thank you. That was beautifully done. And thank you for sharing some of your own experience, which has enriched our thinking about this whole subject this evening. We really appreciate the time and thought that you've put into your response. And it just made me think that I think you're pointing in directions that this could become a series within a series. So lots of scope for development. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our responders this evening. That has been really wonderful to hear, and has opened our minds to think about this book and this subject in so many fresh ways.